y'all for coming today. Before we start, we guys but also like to give you an introduction to the assembly and our wonderful speakers today. So at the assembly, we are a smart lab maker space. We were founded in 2014, and for the past 8 years, we've had over 350 free workshops, so half every year, every single week. We focus on a variety of different topics, so we have three main is PAC, which includes embedded systems, IoT, using the hardware devices like the Raspberry Pi, Arduino, which we provide for the attendees. So last week we actually had an Arduino workshop, we had a working on devices. We also have code workshops that focus on software, where we work with APIs, frameworks, apps, and for those workshops, you'll need to bring your laptop and work with us and code along. And lastly, we also have data science workshops. We focus on topics like artificial intelligence, machine learning, but overall, we cover a variety of things like robotics, 3D printing, AR, VR, cloud computing, and more. Now, our audience members are students, they are entrepreneurs, they're professional. Anyone is welcome. The workshops are for free. We're so happy to have you here. And our focus is on smart technology and practical applications. So we hope you build something new, learn something new, or even just expand on your already existing knowledge. And you can follow us on social media platforms like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, at Make Smart Things. This is also our mission statement. And you can find our online workshops on our website. So this is live stream. Watch it afterwards. And you can check our website on eassembly.eu. Now, our wonderful speaker today is Dina Mohammad-Laity.
We'll go with it.
I'm not mispronouncing.
Let's just go with it.
An experienced data leader advising on topics including data platform engineering, product analytics, and data growth, and data product management. Typically focus on delivering value from data and data UX to improve the analyst experience. Dina brings a refreshing approach to solving data problems. She formerly headed up data teams at Property Finder and Telebot, and now advises companies on various stages of growth from startup to scale up. Now, without further ado, stumbling over there, let's welcome Iris.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm glad I didn't stumble physically, so we've started out really strong. It's great. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming today. Let me go ahead and do a little introduction. As you said, I'm Dina. It's nice to meet you all. I am probably the most interesting thing about me at the moment is I'm working as VP Data at a dating app. Literally the most interesting data I've ever seen in my life. If you want to know more about that, call me. I'll tell you all the deets. But previously, I have started up teams at Telebot and at Property Finder prior to that. Just always been in data, always loved data. I think data is like really interesting. It's a topic a lot of people seem to overcomplicate or frame as something really boring, but I think it's a beautiful kind of creative space that, you know, when you remove kind of what I try to do is, you know, remove the complexity, focus on value, you can really like create some amazing outcomes from you know, investing in data, various data fields. So when it comes to kind of a personal brand, I guess that's it. Maybe a data strategy for humans, for people. We often like forget, you know, we get so fixated on, you know, the lines of code and the numbers on the screen. Actually, we forget what data is, and data is users and customers and humans' voices at scale. And I think, you know, if we start to, you know, bring that back into like the center of actually what we're doing, it becomes a wonderful, joyful space to work with. So I don't really like doing kind of addresses. So I'd love to kind of have a quick intro if anyone would like to share like who you are and why you're here today. You look nice. Who are you? Why are you here?
I'm an engineering by education. I work in the area of monitoring, vaccine, discovery. I am posted here as a team lead in Network International. We are seeing the ingenious machinery that
Yeah.
the bank company I work for.
Amazing.
And, yeah, so data is all my life, and I need to grow up and find the value of the data which I am processing.
I feel like maybe you should come and do the talk. I'm going to sit down. Amazing. Well, it was nice to meet you. Anyone else? Maybe we'll get you started today. Amazing. Anyone else? Victor?
Just interested in data adoption.
Amazing. I'm loving the diversity in the spread. I need to, if you're an engineer or a data engineer, I need to set your expectations. We're going to the lowest of the low code today. But awesome, welcome. I hope it'll be valuable yourself. Amazing. Brilliant. Well, the good news is, everyone, if I completely screw this up, the whole front row can take over the session today. Awesome. Anyone else?
Yeah, my name is Mohammad-Laity.
Okay.
Work on data sciences, so that's why I'm interested in this workshop.
Amazing. One of the most common, so what we're going to cover today, one of the most common places I find it the most useful is with people that work in marketing, because it's all these like disparate tools, and they kind of hopefully put out APIs that they hope people will use in the right way, and they don't. So, awesome. Yourself?
My name is Simon, and I'm a lecturer.
Oh, okay. I love this.
So I think I learned the data set, what's the data set, to gain new knowledge in this topic. You know, it's data science here. It's after that, really like that.
Amazing. I just love the diversity. Okay, wonderful. And the first bit of my section today, you're going to love it because it covers that entirely. And actually, let's hear it for the heroes of the data landscape, the data engineers, the people that keep all the things running and no one ever says thank you to because they don't know it's broken until it's broken. So yeah, I am delighted to meet you all then. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I really love the range of people that have come today. Like I said, the goal of today is to kind of introduce you to what I would say is like the kind of most level one like entry into like how to get set up in a quick, cheap way for a startup. So perhaps in your cases, that might be a bit entry level, but maybe it'll be interesting. So yeah, let's just kick off with like, why data at startups. Maybe you're a data engineer and you want to explain, what the value is of the work we're doing. Oftentimes it's hidden, it's under the water. Like I say, you don't know how important it is until it breaks. So, understanding why and what the goals are of data at startups is super important. And then we'll crack on with a little bit around like how to get started. I frame it as like how to get started and how to get stuck in. There's kind of two different approaches, and I'll share like a common pitfall that I see with people that I work with. They often start in the wrong place. So if anyone here is starting up a business, has a startup, a very, very cool sounding startup, you should ask her about it, it's amazing, then this might be helpful. And at the end, yeah, I'd just love to have a chat. We now have a panel of data experts that anyone else can ask questions to. So yeah, let's crack on. So data at startups. Why? This is something I think is quite common. I know maybe Lee, you might come across this in the recruitment side of like, I'm trying to run a business, I need to hire people. Data is an extravagance, right? And I think for me, it's really important to frame like why we talk about this and why we think about it at the early stages of a startup, making your own business. And the three that kind of sit front of mind for me is that, data is facts, there's a whole part of dimensional modeling around facts. It's a term. So, you know, it gives us facts to make better decisions on. And as a startup, this is important, right? Like, you're probably limited on, you know, time and so on. So, you know, making that wrong decision, actually the opportunity cost is much higher. So, you know, you set yourself up much better from the beginning, thinking about this up front. Speaking about time, you know, data can help you optimize your time and your budget, which might also be limited, and effort. Anyone who's worked in a startup or a scale-up, like I'm doing at the moment, 12-hour days, 14-hour days, it's all committed to everything all the time. You're nodding because you know. You're like, I'm there too, yeah. So, you know, being able to figure out actually, like, being able to identify like what's important now, I think data is the foundation of actually being able to do that. And then the third thing is data can be your competitive advantage. You know, as a startup, you're in a position that lots of like bigger companies, they lose over time as a function of becoming bigger, is that they're less nimble, they're less agile. So, you know, if you have your data, you can collect it, you can pivot so much easier. A really good case in point, my husband's business, actually, he's part of In5 too. He was focusing on his business was all around mass participation sports events, which, you know, triathlons, marathons, so on. 2019 was great. 2020, less so, as you can imagine. But because they were a small business and they were collecting tons of data, the entire business was like data first, data centric. They were able to pivot really, really quickly. And within basically 10 days, they were able to change their entire business model to focus on virtual events, virtual running events, repurposing some of the back end that was used for timing and ranking and so on into, you know, the same thing, but for people, you know, running around inside their apartments or running around their gardens. Turns out you can do a 5K in a 5-meter wide garden. So yeah, so being able to use your nimble status as a startup. So I'm wondering, anyone here who's starting a startup, I mean, yourself, data is your startup. Maybe you could share like what data means to you as a startup founder.
It's a whole subject, actually. Data is everything. The whole thing about setting up a startup is all about gathering data to do something important. Data by itself is worthless. If it's dead, it's not structured. So it's all about finding meaning in what's happening, doing something out. Simply put, doing something with it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there is this tendency, it's definitely kind of like a mid-2010s tendency just to kind of just get data and put it. And that's how we ended up with a term that was data lake, but it's actually a data swamp. So anyone else, is anyone founding a startup that'd like to share, or kind of any thoughts on this question?
Yeah.
Gut feel. Yeah. I think it's a fair point. Although something like when I have these conversations like relatively often, and I often say, you know, people can go violently the other end of the spectrum, right? Where it's like, only listen to data, don't listen to your gut, just listen to the data. But I always say, like, your gut feel, it's data too, right? Like, your brain is pretty good at processing information. Mine, not so much on a Saturday morning, but on the whole, it's all right. But, you know, I think blending these things together, no, absolutely, and being able to identify that, like, maybe I have a bias, you know, maybe I tend to think that my ideas are the best. Yeah, it's important. All right. So, okay, I think we agreed that data is good. We agreed data is good, we should do it. Yeah, okay. All right, so imagine you're starting, or maybe Lee, you might want to continue. Where do you start? How do you get started? Collect some data. Anyone else? Google Analytics. It's like everyone's starting place for anything data, isn't it? Okay, I love it. That's fair. Nice. We're back to data collection. Yeah? Anything? He's got the framework. Come, take the session. Awesome. Anyone else? Where would you start? You know, you've got a blank slate. I told you, data engineers, they're my favorite people in the whole world. Let's go. So yeah, it's tempting to start here, you lot. It's tempting to start here. I've just Googled here. Oh, can you see at the top? Oh yeah, best data analytics tools, which is fine. But the problem is, do you know what the problem is? Oh my God, this is the problem. This is the data tool landscape as it is today. Have you guys seen this before, these maps that get made? I remember when it used to be like this big, but then everyone realized there's loads of money in data and this happened. So yeah, kind of thinking about where to start, for me it's starting with first principles, as our dear data engineering friend has said. So you know, starting with first principles, essentially, you know, breaking down some kind of complicated problem into a basic element and then reassembling from the ground up. I will make these slides available after if you would like the high-res version. Unless you want to take my picture. So some key questions that I try to start with, exactly as you said, you know, really frame what's the problem at hand and what do I need to know. Now, it depends on the size of the company, because actually for like much bigger companies, so the company I'm focusing on at the moment, it's established, it's a scale up. So to be honest with you, what we did there is understand the domains and just chuck it all in. We just brought everything in and then we did it the other way around. But for a startup, you know, you're going to be thin on the ground. Maybe you don't have time, you might not have the people. So actually framing this from the beginning can be a much faster way to get started. So say, what's the problem? What do I actually need to know? Sometimes we don't even think about the question. Actually, and trying to start thinking about this sometimes makes your brain break. Because you're like, wait, why am I worrying about this thing in sales? What's the actual metric that I'm concerned about? And that's when it comes to like, what am I trying to count? You know, do I actually have the right metric? Is it a metric that is easy for me to gather at the moment, but it might not be the right one? Google Analytics, you know, it provides a lot of metrics out of the box, but to a level, you know, does it give enough context? Maybe not. And then actually understanding like, why am I trying to count this thing? So yeah, I always try to bring it back to like counting. Why are we counting this? And I think it's especially important for startups. So that's why I wanted to introduce this idea of an analytics framework. So one of the best examples I've seen of this being done is actually by my dear friend who was the VP data at Talabat. Just this like brilliant brain, like structured everything, like this kind of like concept mapping, amazing examples of domain management and information management. And so a lot of this comes from my experience of working with them. So a good analytics framework has just three main things for me, and it's the first and most important is structures your thinking. Because of that big chart of overwhelming stuff available all the time, it's really easy to get distracted. So I think this really like narrows down like what am I actually trying to solve, what am I thinking about. Clarifies your definitions, inputs and outputs. Metrics sometimes have variance, right? Like, you know, you can define a new user in a bunch of different ways. You can have it, you know, the first time they've signed up, the first time they've installed, so on and so forth. Just writing that down is really helpful because you can start to then map where you have gaps and actually what's the right metric for the question that you're trying to solve that we defined at the top. And then finally, the important bit is to connect to a business outcome. Ideally, particularly for a startup, you don't want to be just collecting and making metrics and dashboards for no reason, for like metrics that actually aren't going to help you make a decision. Because, you know, if you're a startup founder, you're you're the CEO, you're probably kind of the CTO too, you're probably the HR director, you're probably also a marketing manager. You've got other things to do than being the data engineer, because we've got amazing data engineers, they could do it for you. So I think this one reminds me of you. This is something that often we are guilty of. I certainly am at the moment. I shared this with my team the other day. But yeah, so essentially just remember to kind of keep that focus on what the goal is. So what does an analytics framework look like? I break it down into these three kind of areas. So it's basically a document, writing things down. Recently discovered the joy of over-documenting my life. Means you actually have to think about anything, but you can think about other things like lunch or whatever. And being able to lay it out in a clear, searchable manner just takes off so much cognitive load. I really have found like such a massive improvement in my life just from like doing these exercises, because I don't have to remember that thing, oh, like what does that metric mean? Or how do we calculate that? Well, it's in the analytics framework, so you can just remove it from your head and go and think about brilliant new ideas. So the main components of this approach is setting a main goal, clearly describing what you're trying to understand, setting some context. So, surrounding information. If you're familiar with dimensional modeling, we'd call these dimensions. If you're not, then, it's just the groups of things that you might like to think about this metric in context. I'll give some examples in a second. And metrics. So actually, back to that little framework, like what are we actually counting? What is the thing we are counting? And how might we go about counting those things to achieve the goal? So here's one I made earlier. Thought it might be helpful to show you an example. So that's just something I'm working on at the moment. And this is an analytics framework all based around trying to understand where our traffic is coming from. So we spend a bunch of money on marketing, and it's, we want to know, like, is it working? Is the thing happening that it should be happening? We work with an app, so it's slightly more difficult to track some of these things sometimes. So essentially, I've articulated here the main goal. We want to know, like, what's an event happening before someone arrives versus after they arrive. How does that impact some important metrics? So we want to know about where they came from, the visit attribution, and we want to know some, performance metrics around the landing screen performance in particular here. So that's kind of setting out the main goal. And again, sometimes you're like, this is obvious. It's obvious, right? I'm spending money. I want to know where it's going. Just write it down. So the next bit is context. Again, articulating all the context. So here again is the examples we're using at the moment. The important things for us to understand with regards to how we're spending our money are these things. So, are we acquiring more people from Android or iOS? Does it matter? Well, yeah, it does, because people on iOS tend to spend more. So, it's an ROI decision that we're making there. So joining those things up and articulating them suddenly becomes a lot more important than just like, oh, I want to count how many users I have on the App Store. So some other examples here, like location. We have like wildly different performance across different markets around the world. This is where things, like pricing can be, driven by this kind of information. So yeah, some examples of context. And then finally, metrics. So I put here, if you want to skip the first bits, you shouldn't. If you do, make sure you do this bit. This is the most important part. So it's just really, really clearly defining the metrics that are being measured, because this will then inform the collection part, like what you're actually going to go and collect, or even if you're collecting it, what you're actually looking for, because otherwise you're just kind of like sifting through like a soup of numbers, hoping that you're going to get the right one, right? So for me, it's important to do these 4 things. So have, the metric name things logically, so that when you come back to them later, remember you've dumped this out of your brain. So your future brain is going to be more stupid than your current brain. So you need to remember that. So when you name it, you need to make it easy to come back to later. Then putting like the event name, or maybe the name of the source in the database, what the system is, like where you actually find this data, if you can at the moment as well. So doing this exercise can actually show, and I'll show you in a second, it can show you where there's gaps in your measurement. And status, just, do you already have it? Like just keeping a track of it. It's like a little like project management for metrics. I'm sure like actual project managers would probably kill me for recommending this. There's probably some like Asana genius like turning in their grave, but I find this works. So here's one that I'm working on at the moment. You can see these things that I mentioned. So we've got the metric here, the event name, the source, and the status. And here's some of the metrics that we've decided would be useful for us to know in this context to understand and solve the goal that I described at the top. So how many impressions we sent per country, per campaign, going back to that context bit. How many people clicked those ads? How many people installed? How much they spent? linking all these things back together all around that problem and all around that context. So I mentioned doing this exercise in this kind of way, it like visually as well helps. You can see gaps. So we've got a gap here, and it's like, okay, impressions and clicks. Do we get this? I don't know. Maybe actually you're a marketing data expert. Yeah. It's for apps, yeah. Well, maybe actually after the session you can help me figure out what the hell is going on in Google Ads to fill in these these forms. But you can actually visually see, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. I'm actually missing some data here. I need to go and collect it, or I'm missing some data here. I need to put that field in a database. I need to speak to the backend team so it is filled in. And actually, Lee, side note, if you would like these templates, I can send them to you. Yeah, just as a side note, if you would find this kind of thing helpful, I say it's very simple, I think, on the whole. But I have a couple of Notion templates. I just kind of like rinse and repeat, roll out every time. And basically, I find that it means that every single project I work on, it's got this kind of quite predictable, almost soothing flow, because you roughly know what's going to happen. And yeah, so yeah, just get in touch if you would find these helpful. The one we've covered today is this top one. These three follow from them. I'm not actually going to cover them today, but they're pretty logical. Overall, it's just basically, checking, do we have the data? If we don't, specifying how to get it, and then finally a small bit around how to actually model the data into, as you were saying, into a shape that's useful to use, right? Particularly in your case as a data product. So, why? Why do you actually do this? I think like describe what the thing is, but again, like just in terms of the actual value, this is the thing that I understand. Founders might say, I'm busy, I'm doing these 10 jobs at once. Lee actually seems to have 10 businesses. So she's doing 10, so it's 100 jobs that Lee is doing. So why am I going to bother doing this? So overall, honestly, it does save you time. It saves you time. I mentioned about the cognitive load thing. It really does make a difference. I think it really helps. It means you're going to move through your data analysis in a much more organized way because you've got this little framework in place, and it's kind of all the thinking is done up front. And also your data quality will be better because you've done that little assessment first, you've checked that you have the right data, it's coming in, you know where it's coming from, and you don't end up with this thing. I'm sure you've all heard this before. And then we have a few engineers in the room, data engineers, the garbage in, garbage out. It's totally true. And if you're not concerned about the input quality, he's not concerned about the input quality. That's all we can say. I'm sorry. If you're not concerned about the input quality, then really there's no point spending time on any of the rest of like data tools, like data methods. You really will get a very low return. And actually you can end up making wrong decisions off the back of it. So as I say, putting a few minutes of thinking up front before you write a line of code, before you buy any tool, even Google Analytics, I think this really saves a lot of hours, a lot of money down the road. So, what metrics for startups are pretty useful? Again, it can be sometimes hard to take a step back from your business and think like, how do I actually measure my business, especially when you're in it, right? Like Lee, you described two distinct businesses as well. Like you have this crazy context that you're switching between recruitment, humans, one type of animal, and then animal-based businesses. These concepts are wildly different, but there are some quite common metrics that apply across a variety of different domains that you can reuse and be useful. So yeah, just to summarize this, you want to get a read on the health of your business, where to start. I generally start here. It's a really good way to understand like how a business is doing overall, is this idea of the growth accounting framework. You guys might be familiar with this overall. There's a really great blog by Sequoia Capital, which goes into like, it's basically the playbook of like, here's all the things we're going to ask for if you're going to ask us for money, which I think is very nice of them and very helpful. But it's actually a really great blog. They link to a few other resources from there. So yeah, check that out. But the basic overview is this, and this is where I would generally tend to start. So the first thing is active users, grouped by some kind of period, monthly, daily, weekly. In fact, in my current project, we're building a data product. We are having to go down to hourly active users so that we can figure out how to optimize. It's a ranking system, so we have to have something to optimize towards. But then, okay, active users is all well and good, but then you've got to think actually for the definition. How do you define an active user? What is active? You're nodding furiously. Have you come across this before? Mm. Exactly, and it's a really common problem. I wanted to highlight this because it's something that almost every company I've been at and every person I've spoken to and advised crash into the same thing. And this is where you get a lot of issues with trust in data, because you have marketing who are going to be like, we had 1,000 active users last week. Look at all these unique user IDs that we get from Google Analytics. But then we have the product team who they calculate active users as maybe they've been on the website for 30 seconds. Well, actually, it was 900. And they're both labeled active users. And those two reports float up around the business into some report somewhere, and oh, we don't trust any of the data. So yeah, or the worst thing, my data engineer friend will appreciate this. Why is this number different than this number? So yeah, stress streams about that actually from time to time. So yeah, getting that really clearly defined up front. And again, you can have different definitions for these things. That's perfectly fine. They're just different metrics. Call them different names. And just, it's that thing of like having this session at the beginning to make sure like there's actually a really, really great method that I really like. Just kind of skipping up a little bit, but it's called like the BEAM method. There's a book called Agile Data Warehousing. Essentially like build your dimensional model for your business and all the business concepts with the domain users. So you have like the marketing manager and you have the product managers in the room working on building the dimensional models together. It's chaos, but it's great. He doesn't like chaos. Okay. So the next one is user decomposition. So we've got our active users, we've defined what they are, but we need to put them into groups so that we can understand actually how we're growing. This is super useful if you want to understand growth metrics in particular, if you're really trying to grow the organization. Breaking these down into these kind of 4 groups, probably one of the more impactful things that I tend to do in a business, because oftentimes you just don't know, you don't really think about it this way. But breaking this down and the metrics that relate to these, monthly active users, or weekly active users, and daily active users. And then if you divide them by each other, you get a metric called stickiness. For real. So for user decomposition, it's understanding like what a new user means to your business. Again, we can go back to our marketing situation where Google Analytics might say, hey, we've got a new user, it's a new cookie, so new. But actually sales, like, well, no, because they've just signed in from a new device, and actually we've seen them before because we use their email to count new users. Something like that. Like, again, defining that up front, getting everyone agreed, super important. Another metric that's really helpful as well is it's called the quick ratio. So basically you add your new and resurrected, so people that have come back, that previously churned, divide it by the number of churned, gives you a feel for like kind of the growth of a business. If you want one number to measure growth, I recommend this. It's quite helpful. Basically, if you have 1, you're not growing. If it's less than 1, you're shrinking. If it's more, you are growing. Easy. So that's it on where to start. Then get on to where to get stuck in on the actual technologies part itself. I don't know if you can tell, I was really hungry when I made these slides. So we're about to have a bunch of food-based analogies. I have more pancakes coming up. I think I have something about French fries as well. I basically had a goal to finish these slides before dinner a couple of days ago, and my husband was cooking and it smelled delicious, and that's how we've ended up in this situation. I'm sorry. So yeah, okay, I'm going to go back over to you guys because I've been talking to you for a while. So I'd love to know kind of, you're here at a talk called Data Stacks for Startups. I'd really like to know what kind of data stack means to you guys. What drew you here for that term? Anyone? It's pretty good. This is a good answer. Yeah, makes sense. Anyone else? I don't think there's a right answer for this, really. I know you already know the answer to this, so. Yeah, actually, my shift is over. You're taking over now, yeah? Yeah, perfect. So, well, the first thing that comes to mind is data stack. If you go on data Twitter as well, it's a big mess. Everyone's talking about like the cool new thing, and oh, we're back here. No. So the topic I want to share today is some kind of little paradigm I've been working with in the past couple of years. It's a bit buzzwordy, but the idea is I'm going to break it down and show you. It's just a bunch of really quick, easy ways to get going with data if you don't have time. If you're not a Python developer, or you are, but you just don't have time to think about how to frame stuff. And that is this idea that you might have come across, which is called the modern data stack. I actually don't like this term. I think it sucks. But as we've seen, the kind of landscape of tools available on the earlier slide is developing really, really, really fast. There's this sentence that gets used, not so much these days, but like up to about last year, all data talks had this thing that someone would stand there and go, we have created more data in the past 2 years than in the past 2000. And this is true, but we've also created more like data companies because this happened. So that's the kind of actual problem to solve. It's not like the amount of data, that's not really an issue, this is the problem. And there's no set standards as well. You know, I think like software engineering paradigms are a lot more developed, whereas with data, it's going to be a bit chaotic. It's kind of like you just get these things and cobble them together and hope for the best. But there is some shape starting to form. And so what I'd like to share with you today is something I found works really well, is low cost, quite fast to get going. I refer to it as the modular data stack, because, you know, we're talking about first principles. We're trying to break down the problem we're trying to solve, as you said, into these core slices. And actually, a lot of the concepts of the tools that are available today, they're just much easier to use versions of concepts that have existed for many, many, many years, like decades. So there are other options available. I just want to say, this is not like the be-all, end-all. There's many ways to skin a data cat. But it is a bit of a mess. I said like mess is part of the process of progress. And I'm aiming here to kind of de-mess a little bit today. So caveats everywhere. So yeah, let's go back to first principles. So nice of you to have presented my slide before we got there. So it's very congested, the tooling landscape. You know, you could want to collect data. You've got Google Analytics, but then you've got all the marketing tools and everything's happening and everything's generating data. And it's really easy to become overwhelmed. It's confusing. So I think, you know, let's go back and do an exercise like we did with the analytics framework, where we define the building blocks. As our friend politely stated, we get the data. We need to store the data. We need to transform it into a shape that's useful to work with. And we need to do things with it. And the do things I've broken down into analyze and operationalize. It's technically 5 things, but I'm going with 4. So, you know, it's all going to be breaking these down, but I do like an analogy, as you might have gathered. And also, like I said, I was hungry, so I need to make an analogy about food. So I just think it's worth, like, you know, if you want to have like a model way of thinking about this kind of thing, let's talk about where the data comes from, because I think the process is pretty similar to where our food comes from. So here we go, hear me out. So I have this idea of like the data journey from farm to table. You know, you have these like fancy restaurants, they're like, oh, we know where every single carrot has come from. We can pinpoint the exact space on the farm where it was grown. That's a bit extreme, but kind of thinking about like each single part of like tracing the lineage of a piece of data is quite useful. So a supply chain, as some of you, if you've worked in logistics before, has you know, bits of a few elements. So you've got production, cleaning, storage, preparation, and then finally some kind of sharing. You need to get it out there. And I was thinking, like, what's the best food type that I could use that would summarize how I feel about this as it pertains to data? And it's potatoes. Let's consider potatoes. So the data journey from farm to table, you know, like a potato, berries get grown in various places. They have their own like idiosyncrasies. They're grown underground. You need to know where to look. And like Daisy, they're dirty when they come out of the ground. That's my favorite bit of the potato analogy. They obviously need to be like transported and stored to some central place. I'm sure potatoes go in a staging area, right? And you know, similarly, you'll have engineers that need to build and maintain these storage facilities for the potatoes. Sometimes things do go wrong in the transportation stage. Is like the most common place where we have issues. Pipelines break, like canals get blocked, and then finally they're sent off to be processed in some variety of ways, and then are surfaced for the need that you have. So you've got that one potato at the beginning, or little potato family. One of them goes off to McDonald's, one of them goes off to a dessert company. And all in all, I think what we learned today is I shouldn't write slides when I'm hungry. But I hope this analogy is like helpful for how like I kind of think about these slices of a data stack. So let's go back to the first principles. Let's start with the first one, get the data. So a logical first starting point, as our friends earlier here said. What I'm going to do in this section, I'm just going to share a few tools that I found quite useful, I've heard recommended. There are others, as I've mentioned. And please interrupt me if you think that it sounds rubbish and you have some other suggestions. It's my favorite thing. I love to argue. So the first thing is get the data. The first thing is with getting the data, you might actually need to collect it to begin with. You might not already have it. So it doesn't have to be expensive to do this. Formerly it did. It was either expensive or like quite painful. So that's not a great choice to have. Thankfully, we're in 2022 and things can be cheap and not painful. That's great. So event tracking is a really common case. Some analytics tools can be really expensive. If you want to get the raw data from Google Analytics, you need to get through GA360. You know, the starting price of GA360 is around 120,000. Yeah, 120,000 US per year. Like, if you're a startup, like it's out of reach, isn't it? I was speaking with Amplitude yesterday. Similarly, like, you know, you can get going, but you get to a point and then suddenly it's very expensive. So I wanted to share a couple of budget-friendly options. So this first one here, it's called PostHog. It is free. It's an open source tool. It's free if you want to use their open source model. Even like here, the example, this is their pricing example. For up to 1 million events a month, it's also free. And then thereafter, you pay per use. And it's really quite like budget. It's like a paradigm shift in pricing for this kind of tool. Another example is Snowplow. It's completely free because it's open source. All you have to pay for is the storage, which we'll come to that in a minute. You know, these things obviously you need to have an engineer to implement on the site, but on the whole, they have kind of out-the-box SDKs that you just stick on, and they'll kind of start picking up like regular kind of analytics events, so you can do custom as well. And then Segment, which you might have heard of. Again, if you're a startup, in the very early days, this might be a nice route to go down. It's free for up to 1,000 monthly active users. They can have as many events as you want. So it depends on the type of business you are. Like maybe if you're like a SaaS business, that you might have like lower user volumes, but quite high event volumes. Something like Segment might be a good way to go. So that's the first bit on getting the data. Another bit of getting the data is that you might already have it, but it's sitting in a wrong place, it's somewhere else, like a marketing tool. People keep coming to me with random things like, oh, we've got a new marketing tool. And of course you do. Of course you do. What is it now? And these things are going to always come up. And, you know, this is the whole thing, like the marketing analytics space and like the CRM space is developing really, really rapidly. And these are themselves like data tools. So it's really great to get them in, you know, brought into the same environment as the rest of your data, because you can do some really, really cool analysis. So this is where we need something like a data integration tool. You might see these called ETL tools. I think that's a misnomer, but anyway. These essentially are like low code or basically no code tools. They're little connectors that plug into your sources. They're basically other people maintaining API calls for you. So you don't have to worry about kind of any changes. You don't have to worry about your pipelines breaking. It's all managed for you. My previous project, we had an entire data engineer was dedicated just to, you know, keeping an Airflow. If you're familiar with Airflow, it's like a way of transferring data around. But Airflow pipelines alive. It was one whole person's job to do this, and they weren't able to think about what you were saying, right? They weren't able to think about like, how do I be useful to the business? How do I make this data develop value, right? Because all they're worrying about is like, oh, did the jobs run? Do the monitoring, do the ops. And that was a whole person's job. And you can see the prices of these. So as a whole business, you can save a lot of money. And also the data engineer can have a better life, be much more impactful and work on more interesting problems. So the ones I've listed here are the most common. For startups, I do recommend checking out Airbyte because it's completely free for open source. There's some really good connectors in there. This is a screenshot from their page. You can see we've got like Google Sheets, there's HubSpot, all sorts of ads. I've got like hundreds of connectors, and it's so easy to plug it in and you tell it where your database is and it just starts sending the data. It's amazing. I used to spend so much of my time worrying about this because we would have to manually handcraft these pipelines, and not having to do it now, it's actually like a quality of life improvement for some people involved in data engineering. So yeah, that's it on getting the data. A couple of tools that I recommend. Storing. So we've got data. Yay. Where to put it? So I think you might all be familiar with these things, but let me just run through them quickly. So these are cloud data warehouses. Google BigQuery and Snowflake are probably two of the biggest players in the space. Firewall is a new, like, super fast cloud-based data warehouse that's getting like quite like a culty fan base. I haven't tried it out yet. And then of course Microsoft Azure. I've heard really great things about like the whole Microsoft stack. I don't know if you used it. I feel like for sure. And you can run like Snowflake on AWS quite reasonably as well. I think so. You can run Snowflake on AWS as well. But are you saying to use Redshift? Because that's one reason. Also Redshift. But no, I have a friend who's just gone actually recently to work for Microsoft, and yeah, I gather like they've got like one of the most like user-friendly stacks if you're not technical. A lot of their tools are like drag and drop. I've not played with them myself. So for me, I'm very much like GCP land. Learn something once, don't learn anything again. That's healthy. So just a small thing on credits. So if you are making a startup, like I recommend BigQuery because you can just usually get tons and tons of GCP credits. They're really, really generous with startups. I don't know if anyone's gone down this route before, maybe no. But yeah, I think if you can learn kind of the basics of like how like the storage actually works, you can go quite a long way very, very cheaply or for free just off the back of GCP credits. So yeah, just like look up like Google for startups or like GCP credits or whatever. I saw something the other day on Twitter, like one guy had been given $100,000 of credits, and then randomly the next year they gave him another 100,000 because they were like, yeah, okay. I guess that's I guess it's a strategy somewhere. You know, all these cloud computing companies are fighting with each other, so take advantage of it if you're starting your own business. Get some free computers. So the next bit is transforming the data. This is like the most ugly slide in the world, but I have a point. So in terms of transformation, I recommend one thing basically alone, and it's dbt. Is anyone in here familiar with dbt already? I'm like kind of a fangirl about this. It's amazing. Basically, you need to know kind of pretty basic SQL. But getting started is really fast, really cheap. A developer seat for dbt Cloud is only $50 a month. And essentially, it kind of removes, you can create DAGs, which are kind of like concurrent jobs for data purely in SQL by using dbt. I'm not going to go into it massively today, but I'm actually in the process of starting a dbt Dubai community, and there's an amazing Slack channel, and it's where a lot of like the chat goes on with this kind of space. But again, this has been like a massive paradigm shift for just keeping stuff running and getting stuff going faster. And the picture I put on the side here is just a screenshot from the packages website. A lot of companies contribute packages to DBT, and essentially rather than having to like write all these queries yourself, imagine everyone's working with, say, Salesforce data. And so the data comes in roughly the same shape, right? And you've got 100 businesses, they're all working with leads and contacts and so on. And they've got every single business is writing the same queries, right? Because they want to know like how many leads and da. Basically, these packages would like normalize that and make them into like little config files. So again, it's all about like kind of pushing things that have been commoditized and pushing a lot of thinking away so you can spend more time actually making the data valuable. So in terms of transformation, I really recommend looking into this. And then doing things with the data. So obviously, like analysis. Lee, you said about using Excel and Google Sheets. It's like the greatest analysis tool in the world. Everyone gives like Excel a load of crap, but what's the one tool that every single person has on their laptop? But otherwise, there are things you can do that are free or cheap, basically. So one thing I tend to recommend for super early days is Google Data Studio. Obviously, it's better if you're working with BigQuery. Excuse me. It's free, and you can get going quite fast. I keep talking about my husband, but he actually uses. He has a really weird side gig where he's a fantasy football cryptocurrency influencer. I think that's right. Yeah. And he has a newsletter where he basically gets, he has subscribers for his fantasy football analysis, and it's all based around Google Data Studio, which he just spun up for himself one day. So he built a whole business off the back of a Data Studio dashboard. So that might inspire you. So that's just like one tool. The tool that I'm using at the moment, I really like, is Holistics. Excuse me. It's not super well known. But I really like it. I think it started in Singapore maybe, or Vietnam. And it's basically like Looker, except instead of the starting price of Looker, which is really big, it's very cheap. You can get going really quickly. And it's like a little more sophisticated than Data Studio. You can do a bit of like data modeling in the tool if you want to, but I recommend sticking with DBT to do that. And you can kind of get like self-service bits out, so a lot more like drag and drop. So if you're not confident in doing more complex analysis in the database itself, it just breaks down that barrier to actually really get in with the granular data a lot easier. At my the dating app I mentioned, we're using this for people that have never ever thought about analyzing data. We're having sessions, and it's how we're like bringing. I'm talking about startups today, but more mature companies. We're really bringing up some people that otherwise were like not afraid, but would think like, oh, data's not for me. I'm not good at maths. This is a way to like bring people in. And it's been really amazing, quite inspiring. Another like little note. So I don't use Microsoft stuff at all, but there is Power BI, has rave reviews. I know it's got a massive fan base, and I've heard it's great too. And I think it is also free. I don't think you can use it on Macs. So yeah. Finally, doing things with the data. The other example is operationalizing. So basically getting data out of your data warehouse into other tools. This has a horrible term. It doesn't make any sense, but it's called reverse ETL, these tools. I just don't think it makes sense. But anyway, that's what the tools are called. A couple of examples here are Census, which actually you can get started for free. So say you have some data coming from a marketing channel. Say we talked about attribution, right? And you wanted to get that attribution source into maybe a CRM tool. This is how you could do that quite easily. And again, not with like a line of code. You can set this stuff up in minutes. In my current company, we're using Census. I literally set it up in about 5 minutes, flowing our data into our CRM tool. It was amazingly fast. So yeah, that's kind of some of the tools that I would suggest that I've used, that I've really liked, that are cheap, get you going really quickly. I thought it might be helpful to put together an example for an actual case for a startup. So I think the last talk from the assembly was actually about HubSpot, if I remember, yeah. So I thought it'd be logical to start there. I don't know if anyone came to that, but obviously, if you're a SaaS company looking after your leads and making sure that, they're closing, it's probably one of the most important things you can do because you want to make money. So let's assume we've done our analytics framework. We're pretty clear on what we need. We know what the data is. and we want to monitor like our lead status, and say we want to forecast like the likelihood of a lead closing or something like that. Here's how we could do this using the tools that I've described today. So the first bit is, as described, you can use Airbyte to fetch the data from HubSpot. It literally plugs straight into HubSpot. It knows exactly what the shape of the data is that's coming, the data types, and it dumps it straight into your data warehouse, which I've mentioned BigQuery. You can use any other. Then you can use dbt to transform it. dbt is really cool. It has all those packages that I mentioned, and they actually have a HubSpot package, which you just kind of direct the HubSpot package at the data that you've landed, and it will create like about 10 different tables of these kind of standard things that people try to do, you know, like lead funnels or, you know, aggregations by day or so on. Pretty much basic things that are commoditized. Yeah, you can just get that set up. You might want to analyze that data in Data Studio, or you might want to make your forecast in BigQuery, or however you might wish to do this. And then finally, you know, you want to send it back in. So you want to send in like the likelihood of someone closing. You can send that back into HubSpot with Census. So it kind of fits together like this little ecosystem of these quite easy to use tools. And if you had a HubSpot set up ready to go, you could actually get this done in probably like an hour, to be honest. So yeah, I just wanted to share that as just one example to kind of bring it to life of how the things fit together. So yeah, that's basically it. There are some things I missed out. The session was kind of intended to like give like 80% of the idea of like how myself and some of my colleagues in the space have been working and getting, you know, really reducing that time to value with data, which is the thing that we want to spend more time on, right? Some people say I missed important topics, which I did because we're running out of time. So some things you might like to go into more of the detail of any of the topics I covered, from the, you know, the getting, the storing, it's all got idiosyncrasies. But some other bits you might find interesting is like data modeling, because they put it in the right shape. When we talk about like data UX, that's how I see it. So making the data like pleasant to work with as an analyst, thinking about like analysts and end users as humans that are going to look at some data and be like, oh, I get this. This doesn't make me want to cry. This inspires me. So yeah, that's a whole space in itself. Things like metric layers and monitoring of the services. These are super important too, of course. And then of course, cost optimization, particularly for companies going from startup to scale up. What your stack was from day one might be different for year one. And there are ways that you can like optimize your spend there. I'm actually in the middle of this kind of project at the moment. It's like simultaneously really boring and really interesting. So yeah, but I hope what we did cover was interesting and useful. I hope maybe you learned like one interesting thing. That would be great. And if you didn't, tell me, but maybe like over email, not to my face, because I'm not great. So yeah, questions? All thoughts? Lee, are you ready to go? Recruitment, spamming, never. Yeah. Sounds like you need an analytics framework. Yeah. Maybe you could buy me a coffee and I'll help you get started. I actually had breakfast this morning, so I can't be bribed with food right now, only coffee. Anyone else get to share? Thoughts? They didn't care to share. Okay. Like, I can, but it would take me quite a long time. But the example I shared of that, the attribution one is probably one of the better ones. So yeah, the question we got was actually from the CFO. And you know, when you work in a data team, you tend to get these like very broad questions. Actually, one of my favorite broad questions I ever got. I used to work at the Financial Times, and at the same time, I was doing my master's degree in the evening. I didn't know what to do with my project on at all. I had not a clue. So I'll wait for someone to tell me what to do. Very uninspired. And the managing director of the Financial Times randomly one day was like, I think we're giving away too many discounts. Are we giving away too many discounts? And that was actually ended up being the start of like a 6-month-long project, and I based my entire master's on it. So similar to that, for the example I shared of the attribution of like acquisition sources, you know, the CFO of this company was basically like, I don't think that paid marketing is working for us. You know, can we see if paid marketing is working for us? And it was that kind of like expansive space that you can like step into and go, okay, what are the concerns here? You know, he's a CFO, he's worried about the bottom line. We're a self-funded company, we have no funding, so it's really important. Every single dollar is really, really important. So keeping that in mind and their motivation, and then coming from there and like doing that analytics framework of like, okay, well, where are we spending our money? These are the channels. This is like, you know, the model of the various ads, making those metrics, and then kind of following through that little process from there. The actual end result after going through that entire process was that actually not only was paid marketing working, we were getting kind of 3x ROI from some of our channels, but because we'd never actually asked the question of like, is it working? We didn't define what working meant. So we figured out, okay, working means they've come and they've given us some money. That seems to make sense for most businesses, right? And just like kind of putting that and then sticking those data sets together, it's so simple when you describe it in these little building blocks, right? But yeah, as kind of the most immediate example that's coming to mind. Is that helpful? Don't know.
Put your data on the cloud. You will achieve cheaper end-to-end pipelines for analyzing your data and getting the things fast track and implemented. Bigger giant. No.
So it's a good question, and I'm actually like not a good person to answer that. I'll be honest. I've only ever worked in cloud-based environments for my whole career. I've been so blessed in like the direction and the timing of everywhere that I've worked. That said, some of these tools that I mentioned, they are open source. They might not, which means you can host them yourself. So that's one thing in terms of like the actual technologies. So like Airbyte, for example, the post-hoc thing, you can have that all on premise if that's a requirement. So yeah, and from that respect, but otherwise I couldn't possibly tell you, I'm sorry.
Security clearances, areas are certified, not certified, then we will tell that you know you can deliver the same output with the 3 years by putting the data on the cloud. You can't do it.
Yeah.
The security concerns.
Yeah.
And getting the value.
I think it's one of those things where like this model is great for like a B2C product or like some kind of SaaS, whatever. But I personally don't have the energy this morning to fight the UAE government on their compliance laws. Maybe tomorrow. I think it's just one of those things. But certainly I'm sure there can be some ways that you can implement like maybe like the same concepts. Like, okay, cool, we can't use cloud-based stuff, but can we host stuff ourselves? Yeah,
Now,
you know.
the things are becoming easier with all the three, Microsoft and Azure and AWS coming to compromise data centers in this region. So the data is not going outside. They are more
Yeah.
it's comfortable with the practicing posting data on there.
Yeah.
Still, it is with Microsoft. I don't know what exactly is going behind the scenes.
I have to say, it's like a whole area and domain that for me, I'm like, oh, step away. But yeah, sorry, I choose easy.
Common questions.
Hmm.
What person started? What was the common across? So my sense in the beginning of the search, working at building a plan, trying to see how to getting I have an intuition that's maybe tracking the funnel and seeing our users.
Yeah.
Let's say across. And then like the interesting start trying to
Absolutely, 100% agree with you, and that's why actually that when it came to the collection, the events collection bit, that tool, like the first tool that was on the list, PostHog, is really interesting for this because it's an open source product analytics tool, and exactly that. And this is where you know, spending time on that conceptual analytics framework is super helpful, right? Because you map out the user journey and you say what you're expecting the user to do at each stages, at each stage. English is in fact my first language. You can then put those metrics on it. You can build those funnels, and some of these tools, like PostHog, actually builds it for you. You know, it's like I say, it's commoditized. So yeah, that's really, really common. What is kind of next from there is actually more around like kind of say sales analysis, and like particularly with subscriptions and understanding like recurring sales, if that's your business model. Yeah, I'd put that as kind of like second, because obviously, you know, it's that thing of like an extra month subscription or an extra bit of upsell, that kind of like MRR modeling. If you're going for funding and, you know, you're in a subscription business, you know, VCs love a subscription model, right? Good multipliers. So, you know, being able to like really model out these like monthly recurring revenue data models is really, really helpful, because you can start to see like whose spend is expanding, who's contracting. So yeah, that's quite common.
to see how that's so like for you the questions that would have found it, or like customer acquisition costs, like that. These are the two figures that industry. So it seems like an interesting space for data scientists to really know how to connect
Together, yeah. It's true. The cost thing is an interesting one as well, because you know, certainly customer acquisition cost. But what I'm seeing increasingly is around like more like classic unit economics. So not just the acquisition cost, but actually like how much is the stuff costing to run? You know, bringing in like cloud, not for you, you have a server, but for everyone else, you know, these like variable costs. What used to be a fixed cost of like what it costs to run a business is now like wildly variable depending on your number of active users, and can be massively optimized. You know, you can like find thousands and thousands of dollars of savings in like one line of code to optimize how you're storing an image, for example. So I'm seeing quite a lot around that too. Some of the cloud providers are a bit hostile to get this data out. I don't know if you guys have looked into like AWS billing is a whole special space of its own, but yeah, that's another bit as well, because you know, actually, what's the cost of an active user? It's more than just what they cost to acquire, right?
Two more questions. You know, anybody I can get back to?
You're very quiet. Do you have any questions? Could you?
So one of my I've used it for years, and I've gone, I want to use it for me, so I'm sure you'll see this. But I'm not sure. And I'm like, I don't really know, because to me, what I do is quite niche. So it's getting that, if it's getting that information, it's getting that information from somebody else. I know that it's one way of the model.
Mm.
But is this actually something that they use? Because again, it's just my opinion. I don't know how to qualify that.
Yeah.
People say,
Will you pay me?
in my space, that
Yeah, I think this would be more around like, maybe I can suggest a validating product ideas session or something, but the way I've seen this done quite cheaply is by throwing up like a homepage and, you know, kind of like what's it called? Empty doors, closed doors? Yeah, landing page, something doors. Is there any product people? Can you tell me what it's called? But basically getting people to say, oh yes, I do want this at some price. Yeah, that's the way to do it. Like it exists, yeah. I'm actually doing this at the moment. I had a crazy idea last weekend, so I just threw up a landing page and was like, I'm putting some money behind it on Instagram. I'm like, I wonder if anyone's going to buy this. So you can do like, you could do quite targeted. You could do quite targeted ads, so on. Or if it is super niche, I think like a user, like it's a different type of data entirely, but like user research, you cannot go wrong. If you're actually going to these companies and being like, hello, here it is. Would you like it? Yeah. We should talk to Andrew, my husband, because he faced this with his business that he started. The events, kind of sports events business is very similar, like really quite old-fashioned, not like data-centric, not tech-centric. And he'd come up with this product that was like backwards than how the whole place operated, and it was a bit of a slog. But I think it's about like finding like reference customers and getting that user research in from there. But I'm going to stop talking about product right now because I'm product adjacent and I'm not an expert. Did you have no? Oh. Cool. All right. Hi.
Do you have like a sort of application? But do you have any consent management tools that are open source?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. Consent management. I just don't know about that. That would be more like CRM kind of land. It's not something I've ever looked at, to be honest. Sorry.
Just because now everyone is asking about privacy.
Yeah.
So we need to store it somewhere to assign the preference of your user.
Oh, that's fair. That's true. And actually, something that we're building in at the moment is kind of privacy within the data warehouse itself. So something like Google BigQuery, it has like column level security. So who can access like what data on a column level. Also, so that's on our access policies. But also, you can put in place like deletion policies as well. This is very much the kind of really scary EU law stuff that I leave to my data security friends. That again, like finance, I don't touch that. Sorry. But yeah. Yeah, and I was terrified of that. Like, can't the EU fine you like 5% of your revenue or something crazy if you get it wrong? But yeah, sorry, not an expert on that space. Hi.
This kind of big statue is the steps you wrong, you have to pay. of really happened. Working very well. Right to you can that's what you
Yeah, no, totally. And yeah, this is a really common thing actually. So if you hear, he's saying about like, you know, some of these tools, like, it's great because they're free to start with, and then you grow, and then you end up with like a huge bill, which you maybe haven't grown enough, and like the bill has grown like non-linearly compared to your business. So it's a really, really, really great question. I think it's one of these things, like understanding the pricing models of how things actually work before you sign up for anything is really, really important. I mentioned about this briefly on like the BigQuery topic, you know, understanding like storage, active versus like archive storage, like the price difference is huge. On something like Amplitude, I think it's an amazing tool, it really is, but I don't think I think you can get good ROI as a startup for something much, much cheaper or even free, like the postdoc thing that I'd mentioned. So I think before you sign up for anything, playing out those scenarios, like what if we grew by this much, what if we grew by this much, how would that look like? So I think they bill per event, right? So so it's pay as you go, but also, so it's on volume of events and the number of events. So you get the fortuitous situation that you diversify your business and you get more users, but actually what you're paying can go up, you know, 10x. Which, yeah, I think you just got to play that out before you sign up for anything. Certainly goes the other way around as well, though. So, you know, some tools that might seem great because they're free, like open source, actually the long-term maintenance costs are higher than just going with something managed. So when you do these assessments of the tools, bake in not only the cost of the tool itself, some scenarios, but also how much is this going to cost me in people to manage and maintain, because you don't want to end up as the poor data engineer that I described who was exclusively keeping, you know, airflow pipelines alive. But yeah, I think that's the thing, it's just due diligence. But I think you probably spend more time doing this than I do. Anyone else?
No question.
Yeah, I can ask.
Yes.
Is it to like heuristics or when you see companies start graduating that getting maturity where they can utilize, say, data? Is it past 20 employees, is it past 100 employees, like Series A, C, because if you're starting a company, kind of backlog from the building. What's something like version? What's it going to be?
You've asked the perfect person that question, because I'm in the business, I'm in the process of building a startup right now with a friend of mine, and it's not item number one on the list, but I would say it's like top 5 things that we're doing is after having built the back end, getting that data flowing into data warehouse so that it's modeled. It's largely because of like having the business concept modeled so that we can be like, you know, how many of these important things are happening. It's again, it's that thinking done up front. You know, it's the same reason that we chose to kind of go with like a Postgres backend, for example, so that, you know, we put that thinking, we structure the data from the beginning, so that downstream we can use it. But it's also you're asking the worst person, because I come from a data engineering background, so obviously that's what I'm doing. So I think every company is just different, and it depends on like the need. But I really, really, really believe that like most startups would hugely benefit from pushing as much of this as possible to as early as possible. You know, because otherwise, if you had started, you know, say a year ago, of putting together, like understanding where your candidates coming from your recruitment business, you'd probably be in a better situation than today, where you now have a bunch of data that you're like, oh, is this useful? We might have to throw it in the trash. We might not be able to do anything with it. We might be missing data entirely. So yeah, I think it's as early as possible, just to avoid being in this tragic situation. No. Yeah, sorry. Well, the answer, I think it depends.
The framework is taking us. Pose the question like that at every stage. Right?
Yeah, at every stage, and check in. I don't think these things are like done once. Like analytics frameworks, I like get people to check in on them regularly. I think you've got an ML background. Like it's the same as like the idea of drift, right? Concepts drift in machine learning models, but concepts drift in businesses too. So having like this regular cadence of an analytics framework, checking in, like, are we actually still measuring the right things? In 3 months is a long time in a startup, right? What was important then might not be now. I mentioned about the example for the paid acquisition stuff. It's barely even talked about now. It's barely even spoken about because there's other priorities. The business is in a different place. We're now more concerned, what I mentioned about the unit economics and the hosting costs. How do we optimize on our cloud services? So, actually going back to what are we measuring? Why? Under this like little framework, it's very simple as well. I think you can go to anyone. You don't have to be technical to do this. Sticking to like clear, short sentences where everyone can understand the words. There's no acronyms. It makes it really accessible. It makes it you can like maintain it. Because if you remember, like the reason that we're collecting all this data is for the business, right? It's not just to, hoard loads of data like some kind of troll. That's not the goal. So yeah, I think that regular check-in is important too.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you.
was such a lovely presentation. So many great analogies, especially related. I loved it. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you guys. Thank you for that. Saturday, went to weekend, but this is a really cool workshop. But also, we're having workshops every Saturday, so you guys are welcome to come next week after. We constantly post about like the topics that we have on data. So if you go to data at the assembly, you will be able to see the topic for next week. And on your way out, if you guys are willing to give testimonials, that'd be great. We really want feedback on this, and what to do, what to improve, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you.